The room was cold, but her voice burned through the silence like wildfire. "Mr. Sloan," she began, "did Wells Fargo profit from the caging of children?" The CEO blinked once, then again, as if the question had reached somewhere deeper than his rehearsed lines ever planned for. In front of a stunned Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't just raise a question, she raised the curtain. What followed was 5 minutes of fire. Names, numbers, receipts. A takedown so precise, so unapologetically moral, it left America breathless. The man who once smiled behind billions couldn't find words behind a microphone. Because when truth finally shows up in a courtroom disguised as a congresswoman, even the most powerful bankers can't hide behind paper. This story, though dramatized, is inspired by real events, real testimonies, and real emotions. The names are real. The stakes are real. And while certain scenes have been fictionalized to deepen the emotional arc, the questions raised here about money, morality, and accountability are ones no society can afford to ignore. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about a hearing. It's a story about what happens when one voice refuses to look away. The doors of Capitol Hill opened like a cathedral exhaling power. Light poured into the marbled rotunda, catching the glint of polished shoes and the sheen of morning urgency. Mahogany walls loomed high and silent, as if they too were holding their breath. The hearing room was already half lit. Rows of leatherback chairs faced the long table at the front, draped in federal blue. Microphones lined up like loaded rifles. Cameras hung like silent witnesses, blinking red. Tim Sloan, CEO of Wells Fargo, stepped through the threshold with the calculated calm of a man who had faced worse, or at least believed he had. His tailored navy suit cut clean through the air, shoes tapping against marble with rhythm, not haste. Flanking him were two aides, both younger, both alert. One whispered stats into his ear. The other clutched a briefing binder with tabs in 4 colors. To an untrained eye, it looked like just another hearing, another day, another defense, another page from the playbook. But something was off. Sloan felt it, not in his mind but in his neck. A prickle, a shift in pressure, like walking into a room where the air had been recently stirred. The seats were empty for now, but the room didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. Outside, the low hum of press activity crescendoed. Journalists huddled by the columns, coffee in hand, murmuring updates. A few recognized Sloan and aimed their cameras at the windows. He didn't flinch. Let them capture him, looking untouchable. Across the street, something even more unsettling brewed. Protesters. A small but fierce group had begun to gather. Signs hoisted, chants beginning to rise like thunder from the ground up. "No more cages! No more blood money!" Sloan paused for just a second, listening to the chant that pierced the air despite distance and stone. His jaw twitched. Just once. The hearing wasn't scheduled to begin for another half hour, but the room already held weight. A congressional staffer walked briskly past with a folded paper under her arm. Someone whispered about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Sloan heard the name and barely reacted, at least outwardly. Inwardly, a flicker. She was young, eager, theatrics. These types always burned bright, then fizzled out in the bureaucracy. Still, his instincts didn't dismiss her completely. Not today. The chairwoman's seat remained empty, its deep red cushion a stark contrast to the solemn blues around it. Microphones had been tested. Glasses of water had been placed with surgical precision. Everything looked ready, too ready. And then, for a fraction of a second, he caught it. A single sheet of paper left behind on the witness table, just barely peeking out beneath the surface documents. Typed in bold black font, Wells Fargo, Detention Financing and Human Rights Liability Report, Internal Addendum, unreleased. It was gone by the time he blinked again. Someone must have pulled it away. But the words had burned into his mind like acid. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Sloan?" his aide asked. He nodded. "Fine, just dry air." But the air wasn't dry. It was dense. Something was gathering. Something no amount of PR training could prepare for. And somewhere down the hall, unseen but closing in, footsteps echoed. Slow, sure, healed. Tim Sloan adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as he settled into the witness chair, fingers grazing the cool metal of the microphone stand. A deep breath in, slow breath out. He had done this before, many times. Hearings, panels, press conferences, where senators barked and CEOs nodded and nothing changed. This would be no different. A few tense exchanges, some performative outrage, and by the time the evening news aired, the headlines would already be softening. He reminded himself of that truth like a mantra. Just another hearing. His legal advisor leaned in quietly, whispering something about timing and procedural rules, but Sloan barely registered it. His eyes wandered across the room, over the nameplates and the empty chairs where lawmakers would soon take their places. It was all too familiar, the theater of accountability with the outcome already written. He'd survived worse storms with less preparation. Then came the whisper. AOC's on the docket today. It was said casually, but it landed like a dropped glass in a quiet room. He turned slightly toward the staffer, raising an eyebrow, not out of fear but curiosity. Ocasio-Cortez? He said, almost amused. She's on this committee? The staffer nodded, lips pressed together like she wasn't sure how to answer the real question underneath. Should I be worried? Sloan offered a slow, dismissive shrug and looked back toward the front of the room. She's good for sound bites, he muttered. Nothing I haven't seen. He believed that, or rather, he wanted to. Moments later, the double doors at the far end of the chamber opened without announcement. A hush rippled through the staffers and early attendees, not fear, not surprise, but a shift in awareness, like when the wind changes before a storm. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped into the room with the quiet poise of someone who didn't need to announce her presence to be felt. She wasn't dressed for theater, no designer flair, no dramatic flair. Just a dark blazer over a soft gray blouse, slacks that looked a little too worn at the edges, and black heels that clicked softly against the tile as she walked with measured purpose. In her left hand, a plain manila folder. No labels, no logos, but the way she held it, as if it contained weight far beyond paper, made people notice. Sloan's gaze tracked her from the corner of his eye. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge anyone, just walked straight to her seat, placed the folder down gently, and sat with her back straight, chin lifted, like she was balancing something fragile but righteous inside her. There was no whisper from her staff, no flurry of notes, no visible nervousness. Just silence. Intentional silence. And then she opened the folder. Sloan looked away, but not without effort. For the first time that morning, the veneer of routine cracked ever so slightly. He had expected raised voices, rhetorical barbs, maybe a few grandstanding moments aimed for C-SPAN. What he hadn't expected was stillness, focus, precision. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, not in the way of threat, but in the way of truth that arrives quietly and refuses to leave. He told himself again that it was just another hearing, just another round of optics. But deep down, a quieter voice whispered something older, something ancestral and unshakable. This time it's different. And across from him, AOC turned a page in her folder, deliberate, calm, and the hearing hadn't even begun. Not officially, anyway. The scrape of the chair behind him was sharp, sudden, and final. Sloan straightened instinctively, spine aligned, fingers resting in practiced stillness on the oak table in front of him. He didn't need to look up to know the moment had arrived, the kind of moment that shifted a room's gravity. From somewhere beyond the hum of side chatter and the soft shuffle of paper, the voice of Madam Chair cut clean through the air. This hearing will now come to order. No flourish, no preamble, just that firm, unyielding tone that reminded everyone in the room who held the gavel and what it meant when it fell. A murmur passed through the gallery, then disappeared. Sloan lifted his chin, not high, but just enough. Cameras locked on him from every angle. His expression, trained in 100 boardrooms, betrayed none of what had stirred in him moments earlier. He looked composed, prepared, remote, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, kept slipping sideways. To her. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez hadn't moved since she sat down. Her fingers now rested lightly atop the folder, the edge of one thumb brushing the crease as if reading Braille. The room, though full, somehow seemed to orbit around the stillness between her hands. When she finally opened it, it was with a motion so quiet it almost felt rehearsed. Not for show, but for gravity. A single sheet lay atop the stack, clean, white, centered with bold black type. Sloan saw the headline upside down from his vantage point, but he didn't need to rotate it to feel the weight of the words, Wells Fargo finances ICE contractors, a structural complicity report. He blinked once. The page didn't vanish. Across the room, the chair continued reading formalities into the record, but the noise seemed distant now, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. Sloan had weathered questions about quarterly earnings, capital ratios, and stress tests, but this was something different. The headline wasn't financial, it was moral. He tried not to fixate on the phrase structural complicity. It was the kind of language that stuck, the kind that showed up in editorials, not just spreadsheets. As the chair concluded roll call and acknowledged the committee's presence, a pause fell like the brief silence before a conductor raises the baton, a moment suspended between protocol and confrontation. And then, the gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Sloan didn't move, but a muscle in his jaw tensed. He had sat through hours-long interrogations by shareholders and oversight panels. But 5 minutes from this particular congresswoman now felt strangely longer, thicker in air and consequence. AOC glanced up, her gaze settling on Sloan not like a threat, but like a certainty. She wasn't looking for permission or even acknowledgement. She was simply aligning herself with the next movement in a score only she seemed to have read. Sloan lowered his eyes briefly, not to submit, but to brace. In that moment, the room was silent enough to hear the quiet flick of a second page being turned. And somewhere deep in the folds of Sloan's practiced confidence, the echo of something old stirred. Not fear exactly, but the slow recognition that this story wouldn't be told the way he'd hoped. And it was already too late to turn it back. There was no rustle of notes, no preamble laced with fire. When Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez began to speak, her voice was steady, low, deliberate, and deceptively soft. It didn't need volume. The silence it commanded was its own kind of authority. "Thank you, Madam Chair," she began, her gaze fixed forward. "And thank you, Mr. Sloan, for joining us today." Polite, unassuming, even gracious. But beneath her tone was a tension that didn't come from nerves. It came from discipline. She spoke like someone holding a torch in her hand and choosing not to lift it, yet. "I want to begin simply," she continued, flipping a page in her folder without looking down. "Do you believe that Wells Fargo puts profits over people?" The question fell with a quiet precision, like a scalpel rather than a hammer. It was asked without accusation, almost like a prompt on a survey. Yet it shifted the atmosphere, drawing invisible lines in the room, lines between what was comfortable and what was coming. Sloan didn't hesitate. He offered the kind of reply that had likely been workshopped across multiple prep sessions. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice measured, his face composed. "At Wells Fargo, we prioritize ethical practices, community partnerships, and responsible banking. We believe people are the foundation of our work." AOC nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like a teacher hearing a student give the textbook answer before handing back a test with red marks on every page. "Let's examine that," she said. There was a faint rustle as she pulled a new sheet forward, her eyes never leaving him. The folder wasn't thick, but every document inside had the weight of something earned. Research combed line by line, citations double-checked, stories distilled into facts. She didn't come with anecdotes. She came with records. Sloan's hands remained folded neatly in front of him. He resisted the urge to shift, to glance at his aides seated behind. He had answered questions like this a dozen times in the past year alone, and yet something about this moment felt different, more exposed, more irreversible. AOC continued, not with heat, but with an eerie calm. "Because when you say Wells Fargo doesn't put profits over people, I have to ask, what metric do you use to measure that?" Sloan opened his mouth, but she kept going. "In the last 5 years alone, Your bank has paid out billions in fines for consumer abuses, fake accounts, predatory loans, misleading practices. You've issued apologies, rebranded campaigns, and fired executives. And still, here we are. So I ask again, not as a politician, but as a citizen, how do you measure your claim that people come first? The air thickened. It wasn't anger that Phil Sloan leaned slightly toward the mic, his voice still composed but thinner around the edges. I understand your concern, Congresswoman. We've made mistakes, yes, but we've also taken steps to address them. Our commitment to communities is... She raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to pause him gently. We'll get to your community investments, she said, but for now I'd like to stay with the word mistakes, because some of WYU... A silence followed that no one dared to break. The room, already hushed, had fallen into a deeper quiet, the kind that signaled the true hearing had just begun. Tim Sloan shifted slightly in his seat, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if the room weren't so still. But it was noticed by the aides behind him, by the press lining the walls, and certainly by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whose tone remained even, though the edge of her next words sharpened with purpose. I want to bring your attention to a recent report from The Guardian, she said, flipping to the second page in her folder with a deliberate flick. It outlines Wells Fargo's history of investing in and profiting from industries widely known to violate human rights and target vulnerable populations. She looked up, catching Sloan's gaze, holding it for just long enough. The report identifies 4 primary areas, she continued: private prisons, for-profit immigration detention centers, payday lending operations, and municipal bond holdings tied directly to the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. In plain terms, Mr. Sloan, profits extracted from pain. There was a silence between them, not from hesitation but calculation. Sloan blinked slowly, then offered a carefully constructed reply. We've exited those relationships, he said, his tone lighter than before, as if attempting to diffuse the heat building in the room. Over the past 2 years, we've taken active steps to wind down our involvement with private prison operators and high-risk lending structures. Ocasio-Cortez nodded once, as if she expected that answer, verbatim. GEO Group or Core Civic, do you recall which one your institution exited first? The question landed with a thud, simple on the surface, but lined with steel underneath. Sloan paused. His lips parted, then closed. The reflex to answer instantly met the brick wall of uncertainty. He glanced briefly to his left, but no aid could save him from this. I'm not certain off the top of my head, he said finally. It may have been Core Civic, but I'd have to confirm. A pause. Or it might have been GEO. And there it was, the first crack, barely visible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable in the posture of a man whose preparation was suddenly 2 steps behind the moment. AOC's face remained neutral, but her silence after his answer spoke volumes. Sloan shifted again, this time reaching for the water in front of him. As he lifted the glass, a thin sheen of sweat had begun to gather at his brow, catching the light. You've appeared before this committee twice in the past 12 months, AOC said calmly. You've been asked repeatedly about your bank's involvement in institutions known for systemic abuse, and yet today, you're unable to recall which corporation your bank severed ties with first. One of only 2? Sloan exhaled softly, buying time, but she didn't wait. The GEO Group and Core Civic have operated detention centers where children were separated from their parents, where legal access has been inconsistent, and where credible allegations of abuse have been raised. These are not marginal partnerships. They are billion-dollar businesses, and you finance them. Sloan leaned into the mic, voice lower now. Again, Congresswoman, we no longer have active lending relationships with those companies. But you did. A pause. Yes. AOC nodded again, not with satisfaction, but recognition. Then let's be clear for the record, she said. Wells Fargo provided financial support to private prison companies that directly profited from the caging of children under federal immigration policy. Sloan's throat bobbed slightly as he swallowed. Yes, he said quietly. At one time we did. She let that hang in the air, not rushing the silence, not chasing the drama. just letting the weight of that sentence settle in the room like dust no one could sweep away. And now finally the heat was undeniable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room had already fallen into that distinct stillness, the kind that settles when the truth begins to shift from abstract to personal. She looked up from her notes, hands still resting on the folder, and locked eyes with Tim Sloan. "So," she said, each word evenly spaced, deliberate, "if your bank financed the cages children were placed in, why did it take public outrage to stop it?" Her tone was quiet, almost gentle, and yet it carved through the room like a blade. She wasn't accusing. She was unmasking, and the difference made it all the more devastating. Sloan inhaled, slow and measured. The question had no safe answer. Behind him, his aides stiffened, their pens frozen in mid-scribble. He turned toward the microphone, voice lower than before. "We were unaware," he began, "of the specific operations those companies were conducting at the time the financing arrangements were made." Ocasio-Cortez tilted her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in a kind of disappointed understanding. Her fingers tapped once against the folder. "Unaware," she repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like a fragile thing that had just snapped. "So your institution, one of the largest banks in the country, entered into multi-million-dollar agreements with private prison operators, and no one asked what exactly those facilities were being used for." Sloan cleared his throat. "Congresswoman, we conduct due diligence on all major financing, but operational control, what happens day to day within those facilities, is outside our scope. We don't dictate how the funds are used after disbursement." "Then what exactly were you funding?" The question hung in the air like smoke. There was no rise in her voice, no theatrical pause. But the weight of those 8 words was more than rhetorical. It was surgical. Sloan glanced toward the chair, not to seek intervention, but instinctively, like a man looking for the nearest exit. But there was no escape. Not from this question. Not from this moment. Ocasio-Cortez didn't flinch. Her face remained composed, her hands steady. She looked at him not with anger, but with something colder, clarity. And in that clarity, Sloan saw a reflection he didn't expect. The shell of a system that had convinced itself it could separate money from consequence, paperwork from suffering. "I ask again," she said softly, "if you didn't know what you were financing, then why did it take public outrage? Mass protests, whistleblower testimony, national media exposure, for your bank to reevaluate those relationships? Why not due diligence before the trauma?" Sloan looked down for the first time. His reply came slower now, more cautious. "I acknowledge the public response played a role," he said, "and we have since made decisions to exit those industries." "But not because it was wrong?" she asked. "Not because caging children is inherently immoral, but because the public noticed?" He didn't respond, or maybe he couldn't. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't betray the very spin he had entered the room with. AOC didn't press further. She let the silence return, more powerful now than anything that could be said. Slowly, she closed the folder in front of her, fingers never trembling. The gavel hadn't dropped again, but the moment had ended. Something had shifted. Across the room, cameras flashed. But it wasn't Sloan they focused on. It was her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat back slightly in her chair, gaze steady, shoulders squared. Her expression was unreadable. No pride, no rage, no smile. Just resolve. Composed, relentless. And as the room was beginning to realize, unstoppable. The folder opened again, not with flourish but with finality. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't look hurried, didn't look angry, just certain. She reached inside and withdrew 3 neatly clipped documents, each marked with a different colored tab. Without waiting for a prompt or clearing of the throat, she addressed the chair directly. "Madam Chair, I request unanimous consent to submit 3 investigative reports into the record. These documents detail Wells Fargo's financial entanglements with GEO Group and CoreCivic, including specific bond purchases and credit lines that supported the construction and maintenance of immigrant detention centers operating under ICE contracts." The chair nodded without hesitation. "Without objection, so ordered." And just like that, the weight of what had been hinted at became part of the official congressional record. Ocasio-Cortez held up the first report for a moment, giving the cameras enough time to catch the title printed across the front in stark lettering: Private Profit, Public Pain, the Banking Behind Immigration Detention. She turned a page. According to this report, in 2017, Wells Fargo underwrote $187 million in corporate bonds for CoreCivic, the nation's largest private prison company. These funds were used explicitly for the expansion of detention facilities in Texas, Arizona, and Louisiana. The report includes statements from CoreCivic executives thanking financial partners for enabling their growth opportunities during a period of heightened federal enforcement. Sloan adjusted his posture, shifting ever so slightly in his chair. AOC continued without looking up. The second report, authored by Human Rights Watch and cross-referenced with ICE procurement data, identifies $105 million in revolving credit extended by Wells Fargo to GEO Group. The timeline corresponds with the fiscal quarters during which GEO expanded its South Texas Family Residential Center, the same facility that was later found to be housing children in cages constructed from metal fencing and concrete floors. She let that sentence sit a moment longer than necessary, the phrase "housing children in cages" sinking into the polished silence of the room. The third document, she said, holding it up, provides internal memos from investor calls where executives at both CoreCivic and GEO emphasize their favorable financing environment, crediting institutions like Wells Fargo for sustaining operations during politically volatile cycles. She closed the folder slowly, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a form of punctuation. Sloan cleared his throat. Congresswoman, with respect, I believe it's important to clarify the nature of our involvement. These were debt financing structures, common across the banking sector. We did not directly manage or dictate how the capital was deployed. Ocasio-Cortez tilted her head slightly, as though examining a specimen behind glass. Debt financing structures, she repeated. Let's unpack that. Her voice didn't rise, but her precision sharpened. Your institution supplied the financial lifeblood that allowed these companies to expand detention infrastructure at a time when federal immigration enforcement policies were ramping up child separations. Without that financing, those expansions don't happen. Those cages don't get built. Those children don't end up sleeping on concrete. Sloan opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing emerged. AOC leaned in just a little, calm but cutting. Debt financing structures may work in a shareholder letter, Mr. Sloan, but here we deal in accountability, and no euphemism makes this any less real. There was no noise in the chamber, not a cough, not a whisper. Just the thrum of quiet comprehension and the faint sound of another illusion coming apart at the seams. Tim Sloan adjusted his microphone with the kind of careful slowness that buys time without technically interrupting. His voice, when it returned, carried the smooth cadence of corporate diplomacy, layered, qualified, intentionally vague. Congresswoman, he began, while I understand your concerns, I think it's important to place our financial relationships in the appropriate context. Our underwriting and lending practices are governed by comprehensive internal reviews, including environmental and social risk assessments. We work within industry standards, legal frameworks, and established compliance protocols. In the case of our past engagements with CoreCivic and GEO Group, we followed our due diligence procedures. He delivered the words evenly, each one like a brick in the wall he was trying to rebuild between himself and the accusations on the table. AOC listened, head slightly tilted, her expression unchanged. But the moment he finished, she spoke, clean, clear, and without hesitation. These companies profited from human suffering, she said, and your bank made that possible. Sloan opened his mouth, but she continued before he could respond, her tone firmer now, less patient. You say you performed due diligence, that your bank followed procedures. So let me ask you, Mr. Sloan, did your diligence include speaking to the children locked inside? The words struck harder than any raised voice could have. There was no metaphor, no abstraction, just a single piercing question that cut straight through his jargon. For a beat, Sloan didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the committee chair, then back toward AOC, searching for a safe place to land. But there wasn't one. She didn't fill the silence. She let it hang, heavy and honest. Did your review, she said again, slower this time, include visiting the detention centers your financing helped expand? Did it include listening to the stories of mothers whose children were taken away in the middle of the night? Or was it just spreadsheets and quarterly projections? Sloane's voice, when it returned, was quieter and less certain. Congresswoman, our evaluations are based on third-party assessments and public data. We rely on reports from regulatory agencies and internal benchmarks. You don't go inside, AOC finished for him. You don't see what happens once the loan is approved. You distance yourself, strategically, comfortably, because it's easier to claim neutrality from behind a glass wall of policy. A flicker of something passed across Sloane's face. Perhaps frustration, perhaps weariness. But he said nothing. His hands folded again on the table, tighter this time. I'm not asking for a financial statement, she continued. I'm asking about moral proximity, about whether your institution, so eager to profit from these contracts, ever considered the lived experience of the people behind the numbers. Sloane drew a breath, but it was shallow. We believed, he said slowly, that our partnerships were lawful and that any operational concerns would be managed by the companies themselves. Ocasio-Cortez didn't react right away. She let the answer sit in the open air, exposed. So you outsourced the ethics along with the labor, she said finally. No one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was deliberate. A collective stillness, as if everyone in the room was reckoning with the same unspoken truth. Then AOC leaned back, not with triumph, but with gravity. Her work wasn't to shame him. It was to make clear that no one, especially not a man with power and polish, could hide behind a vocabulary that sanitized what others had to live through. And in that moment, Sloane's wall of words didn't just sound hollow. It sounded like the last defense of a story no longer in his control. The air had shifted. It wasn't just the words anymore. It was something unspoken settling over the room like a fine layer of frost. What had started as another routine congressional hearing had become something else entirely. The atmosphere was no longer neutral, no longer a polite exchange of bureaucratic language. It was colder now, sharper, as if everyone in the chamber had realized they were no longer spectators to testimony, but witnesses to an indictment of conscience. Fingers flew across keyboards at the press table. Reporters, once leaning back in half-bored anticipation, now hunched forward, trying to capture every sentence. In the rows behind the committee bench, staffers exchanged quick glances, heads down, pens racing. Sloane's aides, who had started the morning with relaxed shoulders and folded arms, were now scribbling furiously in legal pads, whispering to each other in low, clipped tones. At the witness table, Tim Sloane sat a little too still. His hands, once perfectly folded, were now loosely clasped. His jaw had slackened ever so slightly, and there was something in his expression that suggested recalibration, like a man who suddenly realizes the map he brought no longer matches the terrain he's walking through. Across from him, AOC remained composed. Her posture was steady, her voice never raised, but every word she had spoken had landed with precision. She didn't need to yell. The facts did that for her. And now, as the room shifted under the weight of what had been said, she spoke again, this time slower, with something close to quiet insistence. This isn't just about paperwork, she said, her eyes locked on Sloane. It's about people. Remember that. Her words didn't echo in the traditional sense. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was the echo, an absence filled with implication. Sloane didn't respond. He couldn't, not in any way that wouldn't sound hollow or rehearsed, and for the first time since the hearing began, he sat back. Not in arrogance, not in defiance, but in something that looked dangerously close to resignation. The room took note. Members of the committee leaned slightly forward, their pens still but their attention sharpened. One of the aides behind AOC handed her a document, but she didn't take her eyes off Sloane. She wasn't done, not yet, but she was letting this moment breathe, letting it land fully before moving forward. To anyone watching, it was clear something fundamental had changed. This wasn't just about numbers anymore, not about bond structures, financing mechanisms, or credit lines. AOC had dismantled the shield of language Sloan had tried to hide behind. She had shifted the center of gravity from balance sheets to human beings, from institutional logic to lived experience. Even the chair, usually a neutral facilitator, glanced briefly at Sloan with an expression that lingered somewhere between disapproval and quiet astonishment. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of judgment in a place that rarely allowed for emotion. Outside the chamber, the chants from protesters could still be faintly heard, muffled through stone walls but constant. Inside, the silence was louder. AOC returned to her seat slowly, adjusting the folder as she closed it with deliberate care. No need for dramatics. The impact had already been made. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her face remained unchanged, steady, composed, and entirely in control. And across from her, Sloan sat with his hands unmoving, his words depleted, and his defenses, so carefully constructed, suddenly transparent. The room had turned cold, but the truth had never felt warmer. The silence still hung in the hearing room, but now it was no longer neutral. It had a texture, a temperature. The weight of AOC's last words still lingered in the air when she reopened her folder, this time revealing not spreadsheets or financial ledgers, but a thin, stapled packet with yellow highlighting bleeding through the pages. Her fingers paused on the cover for a beat longer than usual, as if acknowledging that what came next wasn't just political, it was personal and painful. "Mr. Sloan," she began, her voice still calm but shaded with something deeper. "I'd like to turn now to the people your bank's decisions affected most directly." She flipped to the first page. These are sworn testimonies gathered from immigration attorneys and medical personnel who had access to ICE detention facilities between 2018 and 2019. Facilities operated by Core Civic and GEO Group, the same companies your bank helped finance. Sloan didn't reply. His jaw flexed slightly, but he remained still. "These testimonies describe the conditions children were subjected to," AOC continued. "Children as young as 2 years old, taken from their parents, held in cages, and left to sleep on concrete floors with nothing but aluminum emergency blankets. No toys, no books. Fluorescent lights on 24 hours a day. Many cried for hours, some cried until they lost their voices." She read one quote aloud, steady and unflinching. "The room was silent except for the sound of children sobbing. Some were clutching tinfoil blankets. Others sat with knees pulled to their chests, rocking. None of them had been bathed in days. No one shifted in their seats. Even the sound of typing from the press table had stopped. These are not just stories," AOC said. "They are evidence. Evidence of trauma facilitated by a system that chose expedience over empathy and profit over protection." Sloan's face tightened. He shifted in his chair for the first time in several minutes, adjusting his suit jacket as if the fabric had suddenly become too tight across his shoulders. His fingers brushed against the water glass, but he didn't lift it. AOC turned to the next page, highlighting another testimony. One pediatrician who examined multiple children in a Texas facility stated, "We are seeing signs of PTSD, night terrors, regressive behavior. These are symptoms of children who have been psychologically fractured." She looked up, her gaze fixed on Sloan. These symptoms didn't come from theoretical balance sheets. They came from real cages, physical spaces made possible by physical funding. Still, Sloan remained silent. AOC let the quiet build, not out of showmanship, but because the stories deserved the space. She had no interest in theatrical rage. Her power came from the contrast, a measured tone against unbearable facts. "Mr. Sloan," she said softly, "do you believe a bank can claim ethical integrity while profiting from the infrastructure that caused this kind of suffering?" It wasn't a rhetorical question, but Sloan didn't answer it. Instead, he shifted again, slowly this time, and glanced down at his hands. He seemed to study them, perhaps for steadiness, perhaps for something else. AOC didn't press the silence. The testimonies had spoken. The images, concrete, aluminum, tears, had already painted what words never fully could. And for the first time that morning, it was no longer about who had the microphone. It was about who had to live in the shadows of the choices made far away, in boardrooms, in banks, and behind podiums lined with polished brass. Sloan didn't speak, because sometimes silence is the only honest thing left to offer. The hearing room remained frozen in the silence that had followed the testimonies, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't allow the momentum to dissipate. She didn't raise her voice or shuffle her papers. She simply leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Tim Sloan's face. Wells Fargo didn't operate those cages, she said, each word pronounced with a quiet finality. But it built them, financially. It was an indictment spoken not as hyperbole, but as fact. And Sloan knew it. His lips parted in the beginning of a response, but no words emerged. Instead, he glanced at the microphone, then at the chair, as though calculating whether he still had room to maneuver, or whether the walls had already closed in. After a beat, he sat straighter and finally answered, though his voice lacked its previous steadiness. "Congresswoman," he said, "we do not control how clients operate their facilities. Our role is to provide financing when the criteria are met. We are not in a position to dictate operational policy." AOC nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement but not accepting it. She wasn't there to argue technicalities. She was there to trace the money and the morals behind it. "But you choose your clients," she said, "and you chose this." Her tone didn't waver. She didn't raise a finger or bang a fist. And that made her point all the more devastating. It wasn't that Wells Fargo was caught unaware. It was that they weren't caught at all. They had walked in, eyes open. You chose to partner with companies that had known histories of civil rights violations. You chose to fund the expansion of facilities whose purpose, even at the time, was being actively challenged in federal courts. You chose to look at profit projections instead of impact statements, and you chose to do it at scale. Sloan blinked. He opened his mouth again, a breath half formed behind his teeth, but nothing came out. He looked down, then up again, but his body had betrayed the inner shift. The confidence had thinned. The rehearsed lines no longer landed the way they did in mock sessions. His silence was no longer strategic. It was the absence of defense. AOC continued, unhurried but unwavering. "Mr. Sloan, it is not enough to say, 'We didn't know.' It is not enough to say, 'We're not responsible.' When a bank decides to fund a weapons manufacturer, a fossil fuel pipeline, or a private prison network, that decision is a value judgment. And in this case, the value was clear. Profit over protection, access over accountability, return on investment over return to decency." Her words didn't echo because they didn't need to. The pause that followed acted as an amplifier, and everyone in the room could feel the shift. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Sloan shifted slightly in his seat. His hands moved again, fingertips touching, then clasping, then separating. Still, no answer. AOC let the silence speak. It said more than rebuttal ever could. She looked down briefly at her folder, then back at him. "You didn't build the cages with your own hands, Mr. Sloan, but your institution handed over the blueprints, line by line, dollar by dollar. That's what financing is. And at this level, complicity isn't incidental. It's design." His mouth opened once more, then closed. No words, no rebuttal. Just a faint exhale, as if he too was realizing this was no longer a matter of whether Wells Fargo had been involved. It was about how deeply and how willingly. Somewhere in the gallery, a quiet gasp escaped, a soft intake of breath, too small to be called an interruption, yet impossible to ignore. It came from a woman seated in the back row, her hand instinctively rising to her mouth. She didn't mean to react out loud, but she did, and she wasn't alone. Others shifted in their seats, their silence filled not with skepticism, but with something closer to collective recognition. The story unfolding in the chamber was no longer just about money or policy. It had become something raw, something human. At the table, Sloan sat still. His shoulders remained square, but his hands were no longer folded neatly. They rested apart now, fingers splayed on the wood as if searching for something solid to hold. But there was nothing solid in that moment, just the truth, and the woman seated across from him who refused to let it slip away behind acronyms and disclaimers. AOC didn't look at the chair. She didn't glance at the press or seek affirmation from the committee. Her eyes were on Sloan and only Sloan. When she spoke again, her voice was low, calm, and devastatingly direct. "You made millions," she said. The words were simple, but they rang with a finality that struck deeper than accusation. There was no malice in her tone, just clarity. "They made trauma." Sloan didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, not for effect, but to narrow the space between question and truth. "What's your return on that investment, Mr. Sloan?" No one moved. No one breathed. The phrase cut through the silence with surgical precision. It wasn't a question about interest rates or net gains. It was a question that money couldn't answer, but conscience couldn't ignore. Sloan's throat moved as he swallowed, slow and audible. His eyes lowered, not quickly, not as a flinch, but with the weight of a man who could no longer pretend to rise above the facts being laid before him. For a long moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't defeat, it wasn't confession, but it was the closest a man like him had come to acknowledging that some things, once seen, once said, could not be unlearned. Behind him, his aides sat frozen, pens still in hand but unmoving. The back of the room was still hushed, and on the panel, even the other members of Congress seemed to draw back slightly, as though giving the moment space to live. AOC didn't press. She didn't repeat the question. She didn't need to. It had already landed. The room, so often filled with layered conversations and overlapping noise, now felt stripped to its essentials. One question, one man, and the cost of pretending a ledger could measure pain. Sloan finally shifted, not forward to respond, but back, slowly, heavily. His hands, once resting confidently before him, now slid apart in opposite directions, palms down, as if to ground himself. He looked down, and that was it. No speech, no defense, no spin, just the quiet collapse of the last illusion. That distance could protect him from the consequences of what had been financed under his watch. Across from him, AOC sat unmoved. Her expression remained composed, but her silence was loud. It wasn't pride or vengeance. It was purpose. And in that stillness, the story of the day had changed. From a CEO giving testimony to a nation forced to reckon with the cost of looking away. The room hadn't quite recovered from what had just unfolded. The silence remained, dense and reflective, as if no one wanted to break the moment that had left the CEO of Wells Fargo speechless. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knew the hearing wasn't over. Not yet. There was still more ground to cover, literally. She reopened her folder, her fingertips brushing a new set of documents. The shift in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. The subject matter had changed, but the gravity remained. "Let's talk about the earth beneath us," she said, voice even, almost gentle, "and what it means when profit is carved through the ground without consent." Sloan looked up, brow drawn slightly in recognition. He knew where this was going. Everyone did. "I'm referring," she continued, "to Wells Fargo's role in financing the Dakota Access Pipeline." There was a faint ripple in the room, not audible, but visible in the shifting of shoulders and postures. The pipeline had become a national flashpoint, a symbol of the clash between economic ambition and environmental justice. And today, its financial enablers were being called to account. "This pipeline," AOC said, lifting one of the reports, "was built through land protected by treaties with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Land that holds not just legal significance, but spiritual meaning, burial sites, sacred grounds, water sources, and despite direct, repeated objections from tribal leaders, the project moved forward, with your bank as one of its primary financiers." Sloan's hands tensed on the table, but he didn't speak yet. "Those treaties were not suggestions," AOC said. "They were binding agreements. Agreements that, according to multiple legal scholars and court filings, were ignored in the pursuit of pipeline construction." Sloan cleared his throat, this time offering an answer he had no doubt practiced. "Congresswoman, we followed environmental protocol. Our team conducted a review of the associated risks and determined that, at the time, the project met the standards required to proceed. We rely on the findings of regulatory agencies and compliance frameworks before entering into these kinds of agreements." AOC gave the faintest nod, but it wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. She'd expected that line. She had read it before, in press statements, shareholder letters, talking points, but today it wasn't enough. So when the Standing Rock Sioux said, "This will desecrate our land," your response, your institutional response, was to check a box on a form? Sloan opened his mouth, hesitated, then offered the standard reply. "We took all required environmental assessments into account, including those submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers." AOC lifted her gaze. "And did those assessments include the voices of the people living on that land?" Again, silence. "This isn't just about environmental protocol," she continued. "It's about permission. It's about sovereignty. It's about the right of a community to say no, to be heard and to have that refusal honored." Instead, what happened was that heavy machinery moved in before the legal battles were resolved, and drilling began as if the protests, the lawsuits, the treaties, all meant nothing. Sloan shifted in his seat. It was the second time that day he looked smaller than the title in front of him. "You say you followed the rules," AOC said softly, "but sometimes the rules are written to protect power, not people. And what you funded wasn't just a pipeline, it was a message that when it comes to profit, even sacred ground is negotiable." The room once again said nothing, but everyone was listening, because this time the question wasn't just what had been built, but what had been broken to make it happen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't pause long after making the point about sacred lands and sovereignty. She reached into the folder again and pulled out a laminated sheet, a map. As she unfolded it on the desk before her, the overhead lights reflected off the colored zones marked in red and blue, the kind of visual aid that bypassed debate and cut straight to impact. "This is a topographical map of the Dakota Access Pipeline," she said, holding it up for the committee and gallery to see. "The red zones here indicate spill sites, documented leaks from the pipeline between 2017 and 2019. The blue outlines represent land within or adjacent to tribal boundaries, including sites designated by the Standing Rock Sioux as culturally or environmentally sensitive." She turned slightly toward Sloan. "There have been 5 significant leaks in just the first 3 years of operation. 5. Not accidents, not hypotheticals, real leaks. Crude oil spilling into earth and water, some within miles of aquifers used by tribal communities." Sloan's expression stiffened. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his lips pressing into a tighter line. AOC continued, flipping to a summary report clipped behind the map. "One leak, in North Dakota, released over 200,000 gallons of crude. It took weeks to contain. No federal fine was ever issued. No cleanup fund provided by the pipeline's financiers. Your bank was one of the lead lenders." She paused, eyes scanning the room briefly before returning to Sloan. "Do you consider that an acceptable risk?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was firmer, clipped at the edges. "Congresswoman, with respect, pipelines, even well-regulated ones, carry risk. That's true of any energy infrastructure. But those risks are assessed and mitigated through rigorous engineering standards and ongoing environmental monitoring. Our role was to evaluate the financing terms and ensure compliance with federal review." AOC raised an eyebrow. "You financed a project that spilled oil 5 times in 3 years, endangered drinking water for tribal communities, and has no publicly accessible cleanup plan. And your defense is that someone else was monitoring it?" Sloan's jaw flexed. "Wells Fargo was not the operator of the pipeline. We were one of several financial institutions involved in a syndicated loan. Our responsibility was to evaluate the borrower's capacity to repay, not manage the pipeline's physical construction or maintenance." She nodded slowly, letting him finish. "And yet," she said, voice calm but deliberate, "you profited from the pipeline's construction, did you not?" Sloan hesitated. "We earned fees consistent with the services provided in a standard lending arrangement." "So, yes." He didn't respond, but the answer hung in the space between them. AOC leaned forward slightly. "And when those leaks occurred, when oil seeped into the soil, when emergency crews were deployed, when tribal leaders were left to raise alarms that no one answered, was Wells Fargo required to contribute to those cleanup efforts? Or offer reparations to the affected communities?" Sloan shook his head. "No, Congresswoman. That's not how commercial project lending works." Her eyes narrowed, but not with anger, just focus. Then maybe, she said, voice almost a whisper now, it's time that changed. No one spoke. The weight of it all, the spills, the maps, the quiet admission that the system was designed to protect profits and not people, settled over the room like ash. AOC folded the map and placed it back into the folder with care. The legacy wasn't written in ink or interest rates. It was written in poisoned water, broken treaties, and the silence that followed every spill. And everyone knew it, including him. The folder now lay closed in front of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but the silence it left in its wake was louder than any stack of reports. The air had grown heavier, thicker with something more than facts. Everyone in the chamber could feel it. This was no longer about financial instruments or regulatory frameworks. It was about choices, deliberate, lucrative, and ultimately destructive. She leaned forward again, eyes steady, voice unshaken. If you fund destruction, she said, you inherit its consequences. It wasn't shouted, it didn't need to be. The force of it came from the stillness with which it was delivered. The line cut through the room with quiet precision, each syllable falling into place like a verdict. Sloan sat motionless. For a moment, even he seemed unsure whether he was expected to respond. But then he did, straightening in his chair, clutching the edges of the desk like it was a shield. That's not how financing works, he replied, tone tight, almost defensive. Lenders are not liable for the operational risks of the projects they fund. We don't manage construction. We don't operate facilities. Our job is to assess financial feasibility and ensure compliance with legal standards. The reply, though rehearsed, felt brittle now, like a structure held together by habit rather than conviction. AOC nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. She had anticipated the answer. She had heard it before, across industries and hearings and boardrooms. But this time, she didn't let it stand uncontested. Then maybe, she said, letting the words fall like the next stone in a widening ripple. It's time that changed. There was a beat of quiet, brief, suspended, and then a smattering of applause broke out in the chamber. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't coordinated, but it was real. It came from the gallery where activists, tribal representatives, and silent watchers had sat still for hours. Now they clapped, not wildly, not to disrupt, but as if to say, finally. Even a few heads on the committee turned toward the sound with subtle nods, not to chastise, but to listen. Sloan didn't speak. His jaw tensed, his eyes lowered, not to read, but to avoid. The dynamic had shifted so far from where it began that the title card in front of him, CEO, no longer carried the same gravity. The man in the seat wasn't being questioned for his company's strategy anymore. He was being asked to confront its consequences. AOC let the applause fade naturally. She didn't gesture for quiet. She simply waited, then spoke again, her voice softer now but no less firm. We cannot keep separating profit from pain. We cannot build billion-dollar pipelines through sacred land, poison water that isn't ours, and then declare it someone else's problem when it breaks. That model isn't sustainable, not economically, not environmentally, and certainly not morally. She paused, letting that last word hang in the room. Sloan said nothing. His silence, once defensive, now felt like a quiet concession. The rules of finance may protect shareholders, she said, but the earth doesn't care about liability clauses. The rivers don't read contracts. The land doesn't know how to calculate interest. No one clapped this time, but they didn't need to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of awareness, full of reckoning, full of the slow but irreversible realization that the cost of doing business could no longer be measured in quarterly reports alone. And across from her, Tim Sloan sat back, a man surrounded not by documents, but by the consequences of his bank's decisions, consequences that no longer fit inside the margins of the spreadsheets he'd brought with him. The chamber had grown still again, but the energy in the room had shifted into something colder, something harder. After the applause faded and the echoes of sacred land and poisoned water settled, Tim Sloan sat straighter, as if trying to reassert the formality of the hearing. The neat boxes of legal structure and regulatory terms where men like him found refuge. The moment called for distance, and he knew exactly which line to invoke. Our legal duty, Sloan said evenly, is to our shareholders. He said it as if it were obvious, immutable, beyond the realm of debate. It wasn't defensive, it was doctrine. Ocasio-Cortez didn't respond right away. She simply regarded him with a level gaze, the corners of her mouth still, her hands resting on the closed folder before her. If she was surprised by the answer, she didn't show it. In fact, it seemed she had been waiting for it. "And your moral duty?" she asked quietly. Sloan blinked but didn't answer. Not immediately. He shifted his shoulders slightly, adjusted the microphone again, though it hadn't moved. He seemed to scan the room, perhaps calculating how to sidestep a question that didn't exist in any shareholder meeting or earnings call. "Our responsibility," he began slowly, "is first and foremost to ensure the financial health and long-term value of the institution. That includes evaluating risk, maintaining regulatory compliance, and protecting the interests of those who've invested their trust in our company." It wasn't an answer. It was a redirection. The language was careful, clinical, and devoid of the words she had actually used. Moral. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't push, not yet. She let the space between them expand, filling the silence with the implication his words couldn't escape. "Mr. Sloan," she said finally, "do you believe those two things, legal duty and moral responsibility, are mutually exclusive?" Sloan hesitated. "I believe," he said cautiously, "that corporations must operate within the framework of the law and fulfill their obligations to stakeholders. Beyond that, there are conversations being had across the industry about sustainability and social impact. We're participating in those conversations." Ocasio-Cortez leaned slightly forward, her voice low but firm. "Conversations don't shield you from complicity." Sloan's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. There was no policy to cite, no compliance clause that could soften the edges of that truth. "You've said," she continued, "that your duty is to shareholders, but the communities affected by your bank's financing decisions aren't abstract. They're not spreadsheets, they're people. And when their homes are poisoned, when their children are locked in detention centers, when their treaties are ignored and their sacred lands desecrated, your shareholders may stay protected, but who protects them?" Sloan didn't answer. The pause wasn't brief this time. It was long, and it felt heavier than any moment before. "I'm not here," she added, "to question your financial literacy. I'm here to question whether the absence of legal liability gives you permission to abandon ethical responsibility." Sloan looked down, just briefly. Enough to notice. AOC sat back, not in retreat, but in purpose. The folder remained closed, but the case she had built was still unfolding. Sloan's silence had once been a tactic. Now it was an admission, not of guilt, but of vacancy. The moral architecture that should have supported the bank's decision-making simply wasn't there. And in that absence, everyone in the room could feel it. The cold, clinical precision of a system that had built armor out of law and hollowed out everything beneath it. The polished veneer of legal language had cracked. The once confident cadence of Tim Sloan's replies had grown slower, more tentative, as if each word had to pass through a filter of reconsideration before leaving his mouth. His silence, once strategic, now carried weight. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, never one to leave truth buried under euphemism, moved to the next layer with precision. "Mr. Sloan," she began, her tone deceptively calm, "we've heard a lot today about protocols, risk assessments, legal obligations. But what we haven't heard is accountability. What we haven't seen is ownership." Sloan shifted, lifting his eyes to meet hers, but she had already turned a page. "I'd like to enter into the record several statements from former Wells Fargo employees who have come forward publicly in recent years. Individuals who were either terminated or resigned after raising concerns about internal practices and systemic misconduct." He didn't object. He couldn't. These were not rumors or leaks. They were published interviews, sworn depositions, and in some cases, testimonies to this very body. AOC read aloud from one. "Management knew what was going on. They pushed quotas. They ignored the red flags. They trained us to talk around the truth. Everyone knew. There was no confusion. They knew. They always knew." She looked up, eyes steady, voice sharper now. That quote comes from a former Wells Fargo branch manager who resigned after reporting unethical account openings in low-income neighborhoods. Her warnings were ignored. She lost her job. Her region exceeded quarterly goals. Sloan sat back, lips pressed tightly together. The room seemed to lean toward her, even though no one moved. In another case, she continued, an employee raised concerns about how prison-linked accounts were being processed. According to her statement, when she escalated those concerns, she was told, and I quote, "That's not our business. That's a client issue. Focus on your targets." She was laid off 2 months later. Sloan's voice finally broke through the silence, softer than before, but with a rehearsed edge. "Congresswoman, any allegations of employee retaliation are taken seriously. We have channels for anonymous reporting. We've improved oversight. We've changed leadership in key divisions." AOC didn't interrupt him. She let him speak. But when he finished, her reply was a scalpel. "Improvement is not absolution." He blinked. "Internal policies may have changed. Leadership may have rotated, but the script hasn't. The strategy remains the same. Distance, deflect, deny. And while the names on your executive board may be different, the consequences for communities remain unchanged." She placed both hands flat on the desk, not as a threat, but as anchoring. These whistleblowers weren't anomalies. They were evidence. Evidence that what happened wasn't the result of oversight or individual bad actors. It was a system, a culture, built to reward silence and punish resistance. They didn't just know. They counted on no one caring. Sloan didn't speak. There was nothing in his binder that could respond to that. No bullet point on his talking sheet to counter the words of former colleagues who had seen the inside, lived it, and walked away because they couldn't bear to stay. "You call it risk management," AOC said, her voice quieter now, more deliberate. "But what you've managed is the narrative, not the harm. You've invested more in shaping perception than in confronting truth." The room remained silent, but it wasn't passive. The press had stopped typing. Staffers had stopped whispering. There was only one voice now, and it belonged to the woman pulling back the curtain on the institution that had hidden too long behind polished phrases. And with each word, the old script, so carefully rehearsed, collapsed line by line. She waited until the paper stopped rustling, until no aide dared whisper, no journalist dared shift their chair. The air had thickened, not with tension, but with something quieter, heavier, a kind of stillness that only settles when the truth has been circling the room and is finally ready to land. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You don't need to run a prison to build one," she said. "You just need to fund it." The words dropped like iron. The sentence didn't accuse, it revealed. And what it revealed was more damning than any allegation. It wasn't about legality anymore. It wasn't about procedure or due diligence or quarterly reports. It was about complicity, invisible, quiet complicity. The kind you don't need to sign off on because you've already agreed to it with your silence. Across from her, Tim Sloan sat with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles pale against the polished table. His eyes had lost the sharpness they carried earlier. The CEO mask, measured, polished, unshakable, was still on, but it no longer looked like it fit. She continued slowly, deliberately, each word like a chisel. "Wells Fargo didn't design the cages. You didn't transport the children. You didn't write the executive orders or dig the oil lines or enforce the quotas, but your institution made it possible. You provided the funding. You made it viable. You didn't build the machine, but you kept it running." No rebuttal came. No clarification. No corporate euphemisms about structured finance or third-party entities. Only silence. And in that silence, a shift. The committee room, once filled with the static drone of hearings past, had become something else entirely, almost sacred in its stillness. Not out of reverence, but reckoning. It was as if every face in that chamber, reporters, interns, aides, members, realized at the same time. They weren't just witnessing testimony. They were witnessing accountability trying, finally, to break through. AOC leaned back slightly, not retreating, but releasing. "I've asked you about ICE facilities, about private prisons, about pipelines, poisoned water, displaced families. And in every answer, you've reminded us what the law allows, what the board approves, what shareholders expect. But you haven't once said what is right. She let that linger. And that, she said, is why we're here. Sloan blinked, not in confusion, in resignation. There was nothing left to redirect, nothing to reframe. The questions were no longer about his knowledge. They were about his refusal to care. She glanced down at her notes, though she didn't need them. The moment wasn't on paper. It was in the air. I don't need to hear another justification, because somewhere tonight, a mother is wondering where her child is. A tribe is wondering if their water will be safe tomorrow. And no shareholder meeting will ever account for that. No one in the gallery moved. Even the sound of breath had become rare. Across from her, Tim Sloan's fingers stayed laced. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Because the structure he had come armed with, the carefully curated image of a responsible banker, had unraveled, word by word, truth by truth. And what remained was the image of a man in a suit, sitting in front of a room full of silence, finally out of things to say. That was the final blow, not shouted, not branded, not dramatized, just undeniable. The hearing ended not with a gavel slam, but with the sound of slow exhalation, an entire room releasing what it had been holding in for hours. Chairs creaked as bodies shifted. Paper rustled like dry leaves. The sharp energy that once crackled between two opposing forces had dissipated, leaving only the weight of aftermath. Tim Sloan rose first, his movements calculated but slower than before, as if he carried something heavier than the leather briefcase in his hand. His aides flanked him quickly, their eyes scanning the room, speaking into earbuds, forming a protective cocoon. Cameras snapped to life the moment he moved. Reporters surged like a wave. Microphones extended, voices layered on top of one another. Mr. Sloan, do you deny the allegations about CoreCivic? Sir, was the Congresswoman fair in her questioning? Do you think Wells Fargo's image can recover? He didn't answer. His face, a trained mask of composure, didn't break, but it no longer looked whole. The distance between the committee table and the hallway felt longer than it had that morning, and he knew it wasn't the floor that had changed. It was the air. It was him. Behind him, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained seated. She had not moved from her chair since the chairwoman adjourned. Her hands rested on the folder that had remained closed for the last hour, its presence still echoing louder than any document inside. A half-empty glass of water sat beside her, untouched since before the final question. Now she lifted it slowly, took a sip, and let it settle in her chest like gravity. Her fingers trembled, not violently, just enough for her to notice. She didn't try to stop it. No press surrounded her. No aides hovered. A quiet hum of conversation picked up around her as the room began to empty. Some people walked past her without a word. Others offered small nods, subtle acknowledgments that carried more weight than headlines ever could. She nodded back. She had not raised her voice once. She had not pointed a finger, slammed a table, or resorted to theatrics. She hadn't needed to. Her power had been in precision, in restraint, in asking the questions no one wanted to answer, and refusing to be satisfied with anything less than the truth. She came here knowing what would be waiting for her: a wall of corporate lingo, a fortress of legalese, the immovable presence of an institution wrapped in wealth and confidence. But she hadn't come to dismantle a man. That was never the point. She had come to reveal the machine that lets men like Sloan wear suits while funding cages, that cloaks itself in shareholder duty while desecrating sacred land, that pays for destruction and files it under collateral. The machine doesn't shout, it doesn't arrest, it doesn't pull triggers, it signs papers, transfers funds, balances risk, and it always assumes that no one will connect the dots. But today someone had. And though the room was now emptying, and Sloan had already disappeared behind a wall of cameras, the dots had been connected in front of millions. That truth had already left the chamber. It was out in the world now, and it would not go back to sleep. Ocasio-Cortez breathed in, deep and slow. The tremor in her hands began to fade. In a quiet voice, One no microphone captured, she murmured to herself, not in triumph, but in clarity. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to look away. It didn't take long for the echo to spread. Within an hour of the hearing's close, the clip of AOC's final exchange with Sloan had already gone viral. The phrase, "You don't need to run a prison to build one," became a headline, a banner, a protest chant. Hashtags surged across platforms. Hashtag follow the funds. Hashtag not just numbers. Hashtag justice financed. Lighting up timelines from New York to New Mexico. Late-night anchors debated it. Economists weighed in. Survivors of detention centers shared their stories again, but this time with a feeling they hadn't held in years. Hope. Outside Wells Fargo headquarters, protesters gathered with placards showing barbed wire twisted into dollar signs. College campuses held teach-ins on ethical banking. Indigenous leaders spoke before crowds, reminding the country that broken treaties weren't just historical, they were funded realities. By the week's end, Wells Fargo's stock had dipped 5 points. Shareholders were calling emergency meetings. The Department of Justice quietly reopened a stalled investigation into the bank's prior contracts with private prison firms. Sloan, though still in position, had reportedly canceled 2 major public appearances. The silence from the top only seemed to deepen the noise from below. Back in her office, AOC sifted through a pile of letters, some filled with support, others with scorn. But one envelope, hand-addressed and folded carefully, made her pause. It came from a woman named Marisol, recently released from a Texas ICE facility. The letter was short, written in unsteady Spanish, but its final line needed no translation. Gracias por no olvidar que somos humanos. Thank you for not forgetting we are human. AOC held it for a long time. The hearing was over, the storm had passed, but the ripples had only begun, and the reverberations, deep and quiet, were still moving through a nation learning how to listen again. The folding chairs were mismatched. The gymnasium lights buzzed. Children played near the back wall, their laughter punctuating the still air between questions. It wasn't grand, it wasn't rehearsed, it was a town hall, just as it was meant to be. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood in front of a hand-painted banner that read, "Voices Matter." No teleprompter, no aides at her side, just a mic on a short stand and a room full of ordinary people with questions heavier than most headlines. She listened more than she spoke. She nodded, took notes, gave space, and then, when someone asked her how she kept going after that hearing, she stepped back toward the microphone, paused for a moment, and spoke. Not like a politician, but like a person carrying something real. "Power is not always loud," she said, voice steady, eyes scanning the room. "Sometimes it hides behind polished desks and complicated words. Sometimes it wears a suit and calls its harm compliance. But truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to be spoken. And when it is, it echoes." The room held its breath. "I didn't set out to destroy a man," she continued. "I set out to illuminate a system. Because if we don't call it what it is, we'll never change what it does." A teenager raised a phone to record. An older woman wiped her cheek with a sleeve. AOC smiled gently, then said her last words for the night. One voice, 5 minutes, and a system cracked open. There was no applause at first, just silence, and then a low, rising wave of claps, building not out of celebration, but out of recognition. The kind of applause that doesn't end when you leave the room, the kind that lingers, that echoes. This story isn't just about one hearing or one CEO. It's a reflection of the quiet power truth holds in a world often drowned in noise. AOC didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. With calm persistence, she showed that integrity still has a place in public service, and that asking the right questions can shake the tallest towers. It reminds us that justice doesn't always arrive with fireworks. It arrives in moments when someone dares to speak, when silence would be easier. And perhaps that's the real call here. Not to be loud, but to be clear. To stand, even when alone. To care, even when it's costly. What would you speak up for if you knew 5 minutes of truth could change everything? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.